And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much.
4 minutes before the garden party was meant to settle into polished smiles and harmless conversation, Princess Anne stunned the entire United Kingdom by finally shattering decades of aristocratic composure and dropping a devastating long-hidden revelation that the House of Windsor has spent 28 suffocating years trying to bury beneath its gilded marble floors. The woman known across the Commonwealth as the Princess Royal, the silent workhorse, the loyalist who never blinked, never wavered, never once broke the sacred oath of institutional discipline sworn to her mother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, chose the crisp afternoon of the Buckingham Palace summer garden party to detonate a truth so catastrophic that within minutes encrypted palace communications were scrambling to sever every live broadcast feed streaming out of the palace gardens. She had made a solemn promise, a sacred vow whispered at her mother's bedside in the final hours before the world lost its sovereign, a vow she had guarded like a fortress for years, until a single, chilling sight forced her hand and obliterated every reason she had ever held for silence. What exactly did Queen Elizabeth predict on that pale September evening at Balmoral about the emerald choker that once belonged to Diana? Why did the late Queen explicitly forbid its removal from a locked mahogany vault sealed with the Spencer crest? And what dark, hidden tragedy from the year of our Lord 1997 finally compelled Anne, after a lifetime of iron discipline, to halt an entire royal garden party in front of 2,000 guests and 20 million viewers watching live? The gardens of Buckingham Palace that afternoon had been dressed in their most careful choreography. A pale, watery July sun spilled across the manicured lawns, dust motes dancing lazily in the honeyed light that filtered through the ancient plane trees. The scent of clipped boxwood and English roses hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint aristocratic perfume of Earl Grey rising from bone china cups. Marquise the color of clotted cream billowed gently in the breeze, and beyond the terrace, the gilded railings of the palace shimmered against the cavernous, hauntingly quiet backdrop of the West Wing. Guests in morning suits and pastel silks moved in polite, calibrated rhythms, unaware that within the labyrinth of protocol officers, palace equerries, and encrypted radio channels, something was about to fracture. Somewhere deep inside the palace, behind a Van Dyck portrait in the yellow drawing room, a false-bottom compartment in a heavy Georgian escritoire sat undisturbed, its tarnished brass hinges holding secrets that had waited 28 years for daylight. And on the terrace itself, Princess Anne stood in her signature navy and white ensemble, hands clasped behind her back with military stillness, when her gaze, steady, blue, unforgiving, caught the glint of something impossible around another woman's throat. The choker, Diana's choker. 7 flawless Colombian emeralds set in a lattice of platinum filigree, the central stone the size of a robin's egg, casting a green fire that seemed to devour the pale English light. Anne's breath hitched. The color drained from her face beneath its careful powder. For a suspended, terrible heartbeat, she was no longer standing on the terrace of Buckingham Palace in the summer of the King's reign. She was standing in a snow-dusted corridor at Sandringham in December 1995, watching a 34-year-old Diana, Princess of Wales, unclasp that very same emerald choker from her slender neck and press it into Anne's palm with trembling fingers. "If anything happens to me, Auntie," Diana had whispered, her voice cracked and raw, her eyes glittering with the terror of a woman who already knew. "Promise me. Promise me this never touches her throat. Promise me she never wears what I bled for." Anne had promised. Anne had kept that promise. Anne had personally overseen the choker's placement inside the mahogany vault beneath the private chapel at Windsor, sealed with wax bearing the Spencer swallow crest, catalogued under a cipher known to only 3 people in the world. And now, 28 years later, that choker was gleaming around the throat of Queen Camilla, the woman Diana had named in a letter no one was ever supposed to find. Anne raised one gloved hand. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, a flick of the wrist that any commoner would have missed. But her private secretary, Captain Nicholas Weatherby, a man of 40 years' palace service with hands that never trembled, saw it and went the color of parchment. Sweat beaded instantly at his temple. He murmured into the concealed earpiece nestled beneath his silver hair, and within 12 seconds the string quartet on the north lawn faltered mid-bar. A ripple of confused silence spread outward like a stone dropped into a still pond. 2,000 guests turned. 20 million viewers leaned forward. And Princess Anne, the 64th in line to the throne, the woman who had never in her 74 years given a single unscripted public statement, stepped forward and raised her voice, growly. Waited, trembling with a grief she had swallowed for nearly 3 decades. "For 28 years, she said, her words carrying across the hushed gardens with the clarity of a struck bell. The world has spoken for Diana. For 28 years, the machinery of this institution has decided what her memory means, what her wishes were, what her silence permitted. Today I am speaking for her, because she asked me to, and because I have kept my promise for far too long already. A gasp moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Somewhere beyond the terrace, a footman dropped a silver tray, and the crash of it rang across the lawn like a gunshot. Captain Weatherby's hand went to his earpiece, his knuckles white against his temple. Encrypted feeds from 3 palace communications hubs were already attempting to sever the live broadcast. But the BBC, ITV, and Skypool cameras had all locked their satellite uplinks the moment Anne raised her hand. There was no cutting away. The nation held its breath. Across pubs in Edinburgh, pint glasses froze mid-air. In flats in Cardiff, in council houses in Belfast, in cottages in Cornwall, millions of screens flickered simultaneously with the same unbelievable image. Princess Anne, the iron discipline of the Windsors, breaking. She reached into the interior pocket of her tailored jacket and withdrew a cream-colored envelope, its edges yellowed with age, sealed with a wax imprint of a swallow in flight. The ancient Spencer crest, the childhood symbol Diana had used since she was a small girl at Althorpe House, chasing swallows through the summer meadows with her brother Charles. The wax had cracked slightly along one edge, but the seal remained intact. Anne held it up so the cameras could see. This letter, she said, was written by Diana, Princess of Wales, on the 28th of August, 1997, 3 days before Paris. She gave it to me at Kensington Palace in the presence of one witness. She instructed me that it was only to be opened in the event that a specific piece of jewelry, this choker, ever appeared in public on a member of this family. She named the person she feared would wear it. She named the person who would arrange for it to be worn. And she named the man, the architect, the operator, the invisible hand, who orchestrated every catastrophe of her final years. Anne's voice cracked just once on the word final. That man is still operating inside these walls today. The gardens went so silent that the ticking of the great clock above the palace stables could be heard 300 yards away. Queen Camilla, standing near the royal marquee in a pale lilac ensemble, had gone rigid. Her right hand had risen instinctively to her throat, her fingers brushing the cool green fire of the emeralds as though she could somehow will them to vanish. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Beside her, a senior courtier, charcoal 3-piece suit, polished Oxford shoes gleaming despite the grass, clipboard clutched in one manicured hand, a small platinum pin on his lapel bearing an insignia no ordinary guest would recognize, took one slow, measured step backward. His cold gray eyes met Anne's across the terrace, and in that single chilling exchange 28 years of buried history compressed into a heartbeat. He was one of them, the men in gray, the invisible architects, the faceless senior operatives who had run the palace machinery from behind Van Dyck portraits and mahogany doors for 4 decades, who had never held a title, never appeared in a court circular, never smiled for a photograph, but who had shaped every decision, every leaked story, every carefully orchestrated tragedy that had ever befallen the woman the world knew as the people's princess. His name, Anne would not speak it aloud, not yet, not until the letter itself demanded it, was known within the palace only as the coordinator. He had joined the household in 1981, 6 months before Diana's wedding. He had risen quietly, methodically, ruthlessly. He had been in Paris in August 1997, though no official record showed him there. He had been in the tunnel approach briefings, in the security reroutings, in the medical response delays. He had signed nothing. He had authored everything. And Diana, brilliant, hunted, half-mad with grief and clarity in her final summer, had figured him out. Anne broke the seal. The crack of the ancient wax against the summer air sounded impossibly loud, sharper than any rifle report, and every camera lens in the gardens zoomed in with mechanical hunger. She unfolded the parchment, 3 pages in Diana's unmistakable looping hand, the ink slightly faded, but the words as sharp as the day they were written. She began to read. My dearest Andy. Diana's voice seemed to whisper across the decades, carried on Anne's own growly, weighted delivery. If you are reading this aloud, then the choker has surfaced, and everything I feared has come to pass. Forgive me for the burden I am placing upon you. You are the only one in this family with the spine to bear it. The choker was given to me by the Queen on the day of my engagement. She told me it belonged to my future. She was wrong. It belonged to my ending. Within the setting, beneath the central stone, there is a chamber. Inside that chamber is a microfilm. The microfilm contains the names, the dates, the account numbers, and the coded communications of the man who has been arranging my isolation, my surveillance, and, if I am right, and I pray I am not, my elimination. His name is Anne stopped reading, not from hesitation, from necessity. Because at that precise moment a mobile telephone, an antique-styled encrypted device carried by Captain Weatherby, began to vibrate with a low, insistent hum against his palm. He glanced at the screen and went ashen. He crossed the terrace in 3 long strides and pressed the phone into Anne's hand without a word. Anne looked at the number. She closed her eyes for one heartbeat. Then she raised the phone to her ear. "William," she said quietly. The voice that came back was not the voice of the Prince of Wales, future King of England, 43 years old and famously composed. It was the voice of a 15-year-old boy standing outside a chapel in Balmoral in September 1997, stripped of every ounce of sovereign authority, cracked and hollow and drowning. "Aunt Anne," he choked out, and the words were the broken sob of a child who had never finished grieving. "Aunt Anne, is it true? The microfilm, is it real? Is it him? Is it really him?" Anne could hear, in the background of the call, the sound of doors being locked. Heavy oak doors at Kensington Palace, bolted from the inside. She could hear Catherine, the Princess of Wales, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone else, likely a security officer. She could hear a printer whirring. William was already mobilizing. "It is real, William," Anne said, her voice softening for just this one exchange, this one broken nephew whom she had loved since the day he was born. "It is him. Your mother knew." She knew, and she left the proof inside the very stone the institution used to bind her. There was a long, terrible silence on the other end of the line. And then, in a voice that had aged 20 years in 5 seconds, William said, "Do it. Read the name. Read all of it. The world needs to hear her." The line went dead. Anne handed the phone back to Weatherby. She turned to face the cameras. 2,000 guests stood frozen on the lawns, champagne flutes forgotten in their hands, morning coat lapels trembling in the breeze. She lifted the letter again. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, from the direction of the royal marquee, came a single sharp, involuntary cry. Queen Camilla had staggered. Her lady-in-waiting caught her elbow. The emerald choker, in the pale July light, seemed suddenly to burn against her throat like a brand. Anne resumed reading. "His name is Sir Marcus Ashcombe. He has served in this household since March of 1981. He holds no visible title. He appears on no official register. He is listed only as special advisor to the private office, a designation created for him and dissolved upon his eventual death. He was the architect of my isolation from William and Harry in 1993. He was the architect of the tapes released in 1992. He was the coordinator of the Paris security failure on the 31st of August 1997. If I am gone by the time you read this, Anne, he did it. Not with his own hands? Never with his own hands. But with a telephone call, a rerouted vehicle, a delayed ambulance, a paid witness. He is the machinery. He is the fail-safe. And unless he is named, publicly, on a stage he cannot control, he will do to William's children what he did to mine." The name struck the gardens like a physical blow. Sir Marcus Ashcombe. The man in the charcoal three-piece suit, standing 12 feet from Queen Camilla. The man who had taken one measured step backward. The man whose cold gray eyes were, now in this single suspended second, calculating an escape route across a lawn crawling with Metropolitan Police protection officers who had already, on Captain Weatherby's silent signal, begun to close in from 4 directions. He was cornered. The trap had been set. He was terrified. But Anne was not finished. She turned the parchment over. She read the final paragraph. "Beneath the emerald, Anne. Break the setting. The microfilm. The account numbers. The Zurich accounts. The offshore trusts. The names of the 3 others who worked beneath him. All of it is there. I hid it inside the very jewel they used to chain me. Because I knew, my darling Anne, I have always known, that the truth would only ever be safe inside the thing they most wanted back. Give this to my boys, give this to England, and when it is done, take the choker to Althorpe, bury it beside me, let the swallow finally fly free." Anne folded the letter with slow, deliberate hands. She looked directly into the pool camera nearest the terrace. 20 million viewers looked back. In a small terraced house in Merthyr Tydfil, an elderly woman who had queued for 11 hours in 1997 to lay flowers at Kensington Palace pressed both hands to her mouth and wept. In a barracks in Aldershot, a young guardsman crossed himself. In a boardroom in Canary Wharf, a city banker who had known Diana personally stood up and walked out without a word. The nation was, for one impossible, crystalline moment, entirely united in the same devastating grief and the same devastating vindication. Anne turned to Captain Weatherby. "Detain Sir Marcus," she said quietly. "Detain the coordinator, and escort Her Majesty to the yellow drawing-room. She will surrender the choker to my custody within the hour." Weatherby bowed his head, a bow so deep it was almost a genuflection, and moved. 4 Metropolitan Police protection officers converged on Sir Marcus Ashcombe before he had taken his second backward step. His clipboard fell to the grass. His polished Oxford shoes, so meticulous, so aristocratic, stumbled once on the manicured lawn. The cold gray eyes flickered, for the first time in 44 years of service, with something that resembled human fear. It did not last. The men in gray never permit themselves fear for long. But it was there. The nation saw it. The cameras caught it. It was in the end enough. The garden party did not resume. There would be no polished smiles, no harmless conversation, no delicate cucumber sandwiches passed on silver trays. The 2,000 guests were escorted with quiet efficiency toward the palace gates, And within 40 minutes, the lawns of Buckingham Palace stood empty save for the abandoned champagne flutes glinting in the late afternoon sun. Somewhere in the palace, a rotary telephone in the private office of the Prince of Wales began to ring, an antique instrument that had once belonged to King George VI. Its bell a deep, mournful chime. Prince Harry was on the other end, calling from a study in Montecito, California, where he had watched the entire broadcast on a laptop with his hand pressed against the screen as though he could reach through it and hold his mother one last time. His voice, when Anne finally took the call 20 minutes later, was not the voice of a Duke of Sussex or a member of the royal family. It was the voice of a 12-year-old boy walking behind a coffin down the mall in September 1997 with a card that said, "Mummy resting on the flowers." "Aunt Anne T," he said, and he could barely form the syllables. He was there, in the tunnel. He was actually there. "He was there, my darling," Anne said, and for the first time all afternoon, a single tear slipped down her cheek, catching the pale light like a small private jewel. "Your mother saw him. She named him, and now the world has named him too." There was a long silence. And then Harry said, in a voice cracked open by 28 years of unanswered questions, "I'm coming home." He hung up. Anne stood alone on the terrace, the folded letter in her hand, the emerald choker being carried past her on a velvet cushion by a white-gloved equerry en route to the sealed vault beneath the private chapel at Windsor. Buckingham Palace issued no statement that evening. The traditional response, "The palace does not comment on private family matters," was, for the first time in the modern history of the monarchy, not issued. There was only silence. A vast, resonant, historic silence. The gates of Buckingham Palace remained closed. The Union flag above the palace flew at its normal height, but every light in the state apartments burned late into the night as courtiers, private secretaries, and constitutional advisors moved in tense, hushed clusters through the gilded corridors. Sir Marcus Ashcombe was taken, without handcuffs, but with the quiet, terrible finality of institutional collapse, to a secure location in central London where officers from the Metropolitan Police Specialist Crime Command and 2 representatives of the security service began the first of what would become 43 hours of interviews. The microfilm, extracted from the setting of the emerald choker in the presence of a forensic jeweler and 2 independent witnesses that same evening, was authenticated within 72 hours by cryptographic experts. Every account number matched, every name matched, every date, every single date, down to the hour matched. Diana had been mathematically, forensically, devastatingly correct. In the days that followed, Prince William did not appear in public. Kensington Palace released a single photograph, taken by Catherine, of William standing at the window of the private drawing room, his back to the camera, his shoulders squared with a resolve that had not been seen in him since his mother's funeral. Prince Harry landed at Farnborough Airport 36 hours after the garden party. He was met at the tarmac by his brother. They did not speak, at first. They embraced, in full view of a single official photographer, for 11 seconds, the longest recorded embrace between them in more than a decade, and then they walked together into a waiting car and disappeared behind the gates of Windsor. Queen Camilla retired from public duties for the remainder of the summer. The palace confirmed, in a terse statement issued 8 days later, that Her Majesty had not been aware of the provenance of the choker at the time it was placed around her neck by a member of her personal staff. A member of staff, it emerged, who had received the piece from an intermediary acting on the instructions of Sir Marcus Ashcombe himself. Camilla, in her own way, had been the final pawn in the coordinator's final, catastrophic gambit. She had been played, and in the quiet weeks that followed, she was said to have written a letter of her own, a private letter, unpublished, to Prince William, and another to Prince Harry, whose contents remain sealed within the archive at Kensington Palace to this day. Princess Anne traveled to Althorp House on the 7th of August, accompanied only by her husband, Sir Timothy Lawrence, and Diana's brother Charles, the 9th Earl Spencer. The morning was crisp and gray, the wind carrying the scent of cut hay across the rolling Northamptonshire meadows. They walked in silence across the causeway to the small oval island where Diana had rested since September 1997, the swallows wheeling low above the black water. At the foot of the memorial, Anne knelt in the damp grass, and in a small, ancient rosewood box lined with midnight blue velvet, she laid the emerald choker to rest. The platinum setting empty now, the microfilm long removed, the 7 Colombian emeralds gleaming one last time in the pale English light. She closed the lid. Earl Spencer, his face streaked with tears he did not bother to hide, took a small silver trowel and buried the box beneath the roots of an oak sapling that had been planted on the day of Diana's 40th birthday. Above them, in the gunmetal sky, a single swallow banked sharply and flew west across the lake. Anne rose. She looked out across the water. Somewhere far away, she thought she heard, though it may have been the wind, The soft, familiar laugh of a young woman who had once, on a snow-dusted afternoon at Sandringham in December 1995, pressed a choker into her palm and made her promise. Promise me she never wears what I bled for. Anne had failed that promise briefly on a July afternoon in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, but she had kept the deeper one, the one that mattered, the one Diana had truly asked her to keep. Give this to my boys, give this to England, the truth had saved her boys. The broadcast, when the final BBC bulletin closed the story 11 days later, cut to black without music, without commentary, without a presenter's careful sign-off, just black. And in that black, across a nation still holding its breath, still reckoning with what it had learned, still weeping quietly in kitchens and pubs and living rooms from Land's End to John O'Groats, a single sentence appeared in white text and then faded. The swallow had finally flown free.